They were told the British were racially distinct, that Anglo-Saxons and Germans were fundamentally different peoples, that you could identify the enemy by appearance alone. But when 48 German women prisoners arrived at a work camp in Lincolnshire in August 1945, a British farmer's daughter shattered their understanding of the world, not with hostility, but with something that made no sense. A young German nurse named Greta stood staring at a photograph on the farmhouse wall, her breath catching. The British family looked German. Not metaphorically, actually German. The farmer's wife didn't walk past. She didn't deflect. She smiled and said in accented German, "That's my mother's family, from Saxony. We're more German than British, really." As though bloodlines could blur battle lines. As though racial purity had always been a lie. They expected visible difference. They encountered mirrors. And in that moment, everything they had been taught about racial superiority began to collapse. If this story moves you, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more incredible true accounts from World War II. These histories deserve to be remembered. The late summer heat hung over eastern England in August 1945. News of Germany's total defeat had spread through military channels and civilian networks alike, discussed in relieved English and whispered, devastated German. For British authorities managing thousands of German POWs, it meant organising massive work programmes to address labour shortages. For the German women captured serving the Wehrmacht as nurses, clerks and support personnel, it meant forced labour in a foreign land whose people they'd been taught were racially inferior enemies. In camps across England, German women who had believed in Aryan superiority found themselves prisoners among the very people the Reich had claimed were weak, mongrel, degenerate. The regime that had promised them racial supremacy had collapsed. The ideology that had sustained them had proven hollow. Now they stood in small groups, exhausted, confused, waiting to be assigned to British farms and factories by guards whose racial status they had been taught to despise. Among them was Greta Hoffman, 28 years old, a surgical nurse from Stuttgart who had served in field hospitals from Poland to France. She stood with her arms crossed defensively, trying to maintain dignity despite hunger and exhaustion. Next to her was Inga Keller, a former clerk who had worked in Wehrmacht administration in occupied territories. Inga's eyes darted constantly now, always alert for danger, legacy of too many close calls. There was also Sophie Wagner, barely 23, who had been recruited from nursing school in Berlin and sent to serve the war effort. She stood apart, her face expressionless, shut down. The other women had learned not to ask about her family. They were all dead. The British soldiers who managed them were efficient and impersonal. There was no violence, but there was no warmth. They processed the women like livestock, checking names, assigning numbers, organising them into work groups. The women kept their heads down, their Nazi training warring with their exhaustion and fear. "Right, ladies," a British sergeant announced, his tone bored. "You're being assigned to agricultural work. Local farms need labour. You'll be housed on site or in nearby facilities. You'll work 6 days, rest 1. You'll be fed and supervised. Anyone tries to escape, there'll be consequences. Clear?" The women nodded, understanding the gist, if not every word. Work, they understood. The structure was familiar, almost comforting after months of chaos. That afternoon, they were loaded onto trucks and driven through the Lincolnshire countryside. Through gaps in the canvas, the women stared at landscape that looked disturbingly familiar. Rolling farmland, neat villages, people who looked not that different from Germans. The racial distinctiveness they'd been taught to expect, the physical markers of Anglo-Saxon degeneracy, weren't evident. "They look normal," Sophie whispered in German. Her voice confused. "They look like us." Greta had noticed it too. The British civilians they passed, working in fields, walking in villages, didn't look like a separate race. They looked like Germans. Similar builds, similar colouring, similar features. The propaganda had prepared them for something visibly different, obviously inferior. This was disturbing. The truck stopped at a large farm, stone house, multiple barns, extensive fields. A British officer explained through broken German that they would work here, 6 women assigned to this farm, supervised by the owning family. The farmer, Mr. Thompson, stood watching with his wife and adult daughter. They looked cautious, but not hostile. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward and spoke in heavily accented but comprehensible German. "You'll sleep in the converted barn. Work starts at 6. We'll feed you at meals. Work hard, 'cause no trouble. We'll get along fine." The German women stared. A British farmwife speaking German. Not just a few words, actual sentences. It didn't fit the narrative. Enemy civilians weren't supposed to speak German. They were supposed to be culturally distinct, linguistically separate, racially other. Inga found her voice. "You speak German? How?" Mrs. Thompson smiled slightly. "My mother was German, from Saxony. Married my father in 1920. I grew up speaking both languages." She gestured to the house. "Come, I'll show you your quarters." As they followed her, Greta noticed photographs on the farmhouse wall. She paused, staring. Mrs. Thompson noticed. "That's my mother's family, taken in Dresden in 1910, before she emigrated." Greta looked at the photograph. A German family, proper German features. Standing in front of a building she recognized, the Frauenkirche in Dresden. They looked exactly like her own family photographs. Exactly. "But you're British," Greta said slowly in German. "I'm British now," Mrs. Thompson replied. "But I'm half German. My mother never stopped being German, even after 30 years here. She taught me the language, the songs, the traditions. The war was..." She paused. "The war was complicated for us." That evening, settled in the converted barn, the women couldn't stop discussing what they'd seen. "She looks German," someone said. "Her family photograph could be from any German town." "Because her mother was German," Inga replied. "But that means the British aren't racially pure. They're mixed, just like we were told." "But we were told that was weakness," Greta said slowly. "That racial mixing created degeneracy, but they won. They defeated us. How does that work?" No one had an answer. Over the following days, the women worked the farm, harvesting, threshing, general agricultural labour. It was hard work, but they were fed regularly and treated fairly. Mrs. Thompson and her daughter Sarah both spoke German and used it frequently to give instructions and make conversation. More disturbing were the physical similarities. Sarah Thompson was in her mid-20s, blonde, blue-eyed, with features that would have qualified as Aryan under Nazi racial classifications. She looked more stereotypically German than some of the actual German prisoners. One afternoon, working alongside Sarah in the fields, Greta voiced her confusion. "You look German. I mean, you could be German. You'd fit perfectly in Stuttgart." Sarah laughed. "Well, I'm half German. My grandmother used to say I looked exactly like her sisters back in Saxony. Germanic features run strong in her family." "But you're the enemy," Greta said, the words tumbling out. "We were taught you were racially distinct, inferior, mixed blood. But you look..." "I look like you," Sarah finished. "Yes, because racial purity was always a lie. England has been mixed for centuries, Saxons, Angles, Normans, Vikings, all blending together. Add German immigration from the 1800s and you get families like mine, completely normal British families who happen to have recent German blood." Greta felt disoriented. Years of racial training, of being taught that Germans were racially superior, that the British were degenerate mixed bloods, all of it contradicted by this blonde, blue-eyed British woman who spoke German and looked like she could be Greta's sister. As weeks passed, the pattern repeated. The women were sent to different farms for specific tasks, and everywhere they encountered British families with German heritage. A farm in the next village was run by the Zimmermans, anglicised to Zimmermann during World War I, but still clearly German in origin. The family spoke German at home, maintained German traditions, looked indistinguishably German. Another family, the Fischers, originally Fischer, had a grandmother who had emigrated from Bavaria in 1895. She still lived with them, speaking German, cooking German food, maintaining German customs. The grandsons looked like German soldiers, actual German soldiers. The racial theory collapsed under accumulated evidence. If these British people, who had German blood, German features, German culture, were degenerate and inferior, why had they won? If racial purity was strength, why had the racially pure Germans lost to these mixed-blood British? Sophie articulated it during an evening discussion in the barn. I can't reconcile what we see with what we were taught. We were told racial mixing was weakness, but these British families with German blood are strong, healthy, successful. They defeated us. Maybe, Inga said slowly, what we were taught was wrong, not just tactically wrong, fundamentally, completely wrong. The suggestion hung in the air, dangerous and liberating. 3 months into their captivity, in November 1945, something crystallized the transformation. Mrs. Samusi Thompson invited the German women to Sunday dinner at the farmhouse, an unusual gesture that surprised everyone. The women accepted nervously, uncertain what this meant. The dinner was simple but abundant. Roast chicken, vegetables, bread, cider. As they ate, Mrs. Thompson's mother joined them, the actual German immigrant, now in her 70s, who had left Saxony in 1920 and never returned. She looked at the German women with tears in her eyes and spoke in German. You remind me of home, of Germany before the wars, of my sisters and cousins and nieces. The German women stared at her. This elderly British woman with a German accent, German mannerisms, German expressions. She looked like their grandmothers. She spoke like their grandmothers. Why did you leave Germany? Greta asked. The old woman sighed. I fell in love with an Englishman. He was kind, gentle, nothing like the harsh German men I'd known. I chose love over country. I came here, married him, raised children, but I never stopped being German in my heart. She looked around the table. And now German girls sit in my house again. The war brought you. It's strange how life works. Sarah added, growing up, we always knew we were part German. Grandmother made sure of that. She taught us the language, told us stories about Saxony, cooked German food. We celebrated German holidays alongside British ones. Weren't you persecuted? Sophie asked. During the war? For being German? Some suspicion, Mrs. Thompson admitted. Some unkindness. But mostly people knew us. Knew we were British, even if we had German blood. It was complicated. My mother cried when Germany and Britain went to war. She had family on both sides. The war killed her nephew in Dresden and her son-in-law's brother at Normandy. How do you process that? The question needed no answer. After dinner, the old German grandmother showed them photographs. Her family in Saxony in the early 1900s, her wedding to her British husband, her children growing up in England. The progression of a German woman becoming British while remaining German. Greta looked at the photographs and felt tears streaming down her face. You're German, she said. You look German, speak German, maintain German culture. But you're British. How? The grandmother smiled sadly. Because nationality is newer and shallower than they want you to believe. Because humans have always moved, married, mixed. Because racial purity is a myth invented by people who needed an excuse for hatred. Because you can be both, German and British, maintaining one heritage while embracing another. She paused. The Nazis wanted you to believe in pure races, in fundamental differences. But look at my family. Look at my grandchildren. Are they degenerate? Are they weak? They're healthy, strong, good people. What does that say about racial purity? That night, Back in the barn, the German women couldn't sleep. The evening had shattered too much. "They're German," Inga kept repeating. "Actually German, not metaphorically. That grandmother could be from any town in Saxony, and her grandchildren look like perfect Nazi propaganda posters. But they're British, they're mixed. They're everything we were taught was weak and degenerate." "And they won," Greta added quietly. "They defeated the racially pure Aryans." "What does that mean for everything we believed?" "It means," Sophie said, her voice hollow, "that we were lied to. About race, about purity, about superiority. We were lied to about everything." The recognition was devastating and necessary. As winter deepened, the relationships between the German prisoners and their British hosts evolved. The women were still prisoners, still constrained, still longing for home. But they could no longer maintain the racial superiority that had sustained them through service and defeat. Every day brought more evidence. The British weren't racially distinct. Many had German blood. They maintained German culture. They looked like Germans. They were, in many ways, partially German. The theory collapsed. Greta began helping Mrs. Thompson in the house, working on cooking and preserving. As they worked, Mrs. Thompson told stories about her German mother, about growing up between two cultures, about maintaining heritage while embracing new identity. "My mother used to say," Mrs. Thompson shared, "that people are people regardless of borders, that love crosses boundaries, that families blend and mix, that racial purity is an illusion because humans have always travelled and married and merged." "We were taught the opposite," Greta admitted. "That racial purity was strength, that Germans were superior." "And you believed it?" "Yes. Until I came here. Until I saw British people who look German, speak German, maintain German culture. Until the evidence became undeniable." Mrs. Thompson nodded. "That's how propaganda dies, not through argument, but through evidence. Through seeing that the world is more complicated than they told you." In early 1946, news came that the German women would be repatriated. The reaction was complex: relief at going home, fear of what remained, grief at leaving connections formed. On their last evening, the Thompson family hosted a farewell dinner. Mrs. Thompson's mother gave each German woman a small gift, a handkerchief embroidered with German patterns, made with her own hands. "Remember," the old woman said in German, "that people are more complicated than nations, that families cross borders, that blood doesn't respect battle lines, that the woman who looks like you might be your enemy, but she might also be your relative, separated by emigration rather than nature." Greta embraced her, tears flowing. "You changed how I see the world. You proved that everything I believed about race was wrong. Thank you." Sarah hugged each woman. "Go home, rebuild. Remember that the British you fought, some of us are part German. Remember that mixing makes us stronger, not weaker. Remember that racial purity was always a lie." As the truck drove away, Greta looked back at the farm. The Thompson family stood waving, British people with German blood, German features, German culture. Living proof that racial theory was bankrupt. Decades passed. The German women scattered across divided Germany, rebuilding lives in the ruins. Some never spoke of what they'd learned in England, unable to reconcile it with the narratives that survived. Others told carefully edited versions. Greta became a nurse again, working in a Stuttgart hospital. She treated all patients equally, regardless of background, nationality, or ethnicity. When asked why she was so adamant about this, she told them about the British family with German blood, who had shown her that racial purity was a lie. Inga worked in refugee services, helping displaced persons from across Europe. She had learned that people were more complex than nationality, that mixing was inevitable and not weakness. Sophie became a teacher, teaching students about the dangers of racial ideology, using her own experience as evidence of how propaganda could deceive entire populations. In 1985, 40 years after the war's end, Greta received a letter from England. It was from Sarah Thompson, now Sarah Mitchell, writing to say her grandmother had passed away, but had asked before dying that Greta be told something. The letter included the old woman's final message. "Tell Greta that she helped me too. I spent the war years hiding my German heritage, pretending it didn't exist, ashamed of the blood I carried. But when those German girls came to our farm, when they saw that I was German and British both, when they learned from me, it let me reclaim the heritage I'd been forced to hide. They gave me back my German identity by accepting that it could coexist with being British. Tell her that teaching changes both teacher and student. Tell her that I died proud of being German and British both, and she helped make that possible." Greta read the letter 3 times, overwhelmed. She had thought she was the one who learned. She hadn't realized she'd taught something too. Years later, Greta's daughter found among her mother's papers a journal entry from 1945, written shortly after returning to Germany. "I expected the British to look different from us, to be visibly distinct, racially inferior, obviously degenerate as we'd been taught. Instead, I found families with German blood, German features, German culture. I found a grandmother who looked like mine, spoke like mine, cooked like mine, but who was British. I found a girl my age who could have been my sister, who looked more Aryan than many actual Germans, but who was the enemy. The British didn't defeat our armies with their weapons. They defeated our ideology with their faces, our racial theory with their bloodlines, our certainty about purity with the undeniable evidence that mixing had made them strong, not weak. In Lincolnshire, I learned that racial purity was always a lie, that families cross borders that politics create, and that the person who looks exactly like you might be your enemy not because of blood, but because of the arbitrary lines drawn on maps. I could never return to the certainty I'd had before." The story of Greta and the German POWs who discovered their British captors looked like them is not widely known. It doesn't fit neatly into narratives of Nazi defeat or racial theories' collapse. But it's a story worth remembering because it reminds us that in the midst of history's greatest racial hatred, the evidence of shared humanity was written on faces and carried in bloodlines. Sometimes the most powerful refutation of racial theory is simply seeing that the enemy looks like you. Sometimes mixing proves stronger than purity. And sometimes the hardest truth to accept, and the most liberating, is that racial categories are political inventions, that families have always crossed borders, and that the person who could be your sister might wear an enemy uniform simply because her grandmother chose love over nation and emigrated to a land that would become your enemy 2 generations later. War made enemies of relatives who didn't know they were related. Peace requires remembering that borders are newer than the families they divide. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe for more incredible true accounts from World War II. Human stories that complicate our understanding of race and nation, of purity and mixing, of what it means to discover that the enemy looks like you because blood crossed borders before armies did. These stories deserve to be remembered and shared. Thank you for watching.